Would you turn with me, please, to the words that we read there in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, and reading again verse 9. And toward the end of verse 9 we read, Noah walked with God. Noah walked with God. We're continuing our studies in the life of Noah today. We began it last week, and we're calling this series The First Lockdown. The First Lockdown. And today we're going to be looking at this man called Noah and what he heard from God, God's message to him. And the message that God had for him was very simple. The message was, judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. So we're going to look today at verses 9 through to 13 of Genesis 6, and we're looking at it under two headings. We're looking at the description of Noah and then the declaration of God. The description of Noah and the declaration of God. First we have the description of Noah in verses 9 and 10. And here Moses focuses on Noah's righteousness. Noah's righteousness. Before going any further, let's remember what we saw last week. We focused on the depravity of man in verses 1 to 5. We saw that this was a time when godly marriage was being disregarded, and we saw that it was a time when inhumane violence was being celebrated. Wherever God looked, he saw wickedness. Wherever he looked, he saw that the intentions of man's heart was on evil continually. And we focused on the displeasure of the Lord in verses 6 to 8. We saw the Lord's grief as he regrets making man, and he resolves to blot out, obliterate, wipe out man. But we also saw the Lord's grace as this man, Noah, found favour in his eyes, found favour in his sight. And as we considered these verses, we noted three key points. We noted that no sin goes unnoticed. We also noted that no sin goes unpunished. And finally, we noted that our only hope is the undeserved grace, the unmerited favour of God, that grace, that favour that is ultimately found in Christ alone. And we now come to Moses' description of Noah, this recipient of grace, in verses 9 and 10. Moses begins by telling us that Noah was a righteous man. Look at verse 9. Now, a righteous person is someone who meets a standard of right conduct. According to Moses, the absolute standard of right conduct is the character of God and his law. The person who meets that standard doesn't suffer divine punishment, but the person who rebels against that standard meets divine condemnation. And here Moses tells us that Noah was a righteous man. His life was one of habitual righteousness. He recognized and observed his responsibilities toward God and man. Noah did what was right. He lived uprightly before his God. Moses proceeds to tell us that Noah was blameless in his generation. Look again at verse 9. This word blameless means whole or completely sound. It's a word that Moses uses to describe the sacrifices that were to be blameless, free from blemish, free from spot, free from defect. It's a word that indicates purity. And here Moses tells us that Noah was blameless, pure, without spot in his generation. He stood out from the crowd. He didn't behave as those round about him behaved. His life was above reproach. People noticed that he was different. When they spoke about him, when they looked at him, they saw that he was a man who wasn't as they were. But Moses goes even further as he tells us that Noah was a man who walked with God. Now, this idea has already been seen in Genesis 5. Noah's great-grandfather Enoch is described as one who walked with God. He didn't simply walk before God, neither did he simply walk after God. He's a man who walked with God. His life was one of a living faith, a living relationship with God. And then one day he was simply taken by God. He never tasted death. And here Moses tells us that Enoch's great-grandson also walked with God. It's an indicator that Noah enjoyed closeness with God. It's an indicator that Noah enjoyed communion with God. But it's also an indicator that like Noah, like Enoch, who was spared death, Noah will also be spared the destruction that God had threatened in verses 6 and 7. And finally, Moses tells us that Noah was a father. Look at verse 10. Back in Genesis 5:32, we read, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And now in Genesis 6 verse 10 we read, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This repeated detail that Noah had 3 sons is a key factor. Adam, the first man, had 3 sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth, through whom the human race was populated. And now Noah, who is going to function as a kind of second Adam, is also described as having 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and through them the human race will again be populated. And it will also be through one of these sons that the promised seed, the serpent crusher of Genesis 3:15, the fulfillment of God's promises of blessing will eventually come. These sons are therefore very significant, and it's significant that Noah has 3 of them. Well, friends, as we consider this description of Noah, we can see the difference that grace makes. The difference that grace makes. We see that in Noah's life. Last week we saw that Noah was a man who found favour or grace in the eyes of God. He didn't work for it, he didn't earn it, he didn't merit it, he simply received it as a free and undeserved gift. And that grace made an impact and impression on Noah's life. It bore fruit in his life. Moses tells us that Noah was a righteous man. Moses tells us that Noah was a man blameless in his generation. And Moses tells us that Noah was a man who walked with God. But it's not just Moses who tells us this. It's not just Moses who testifies to the difference in Noah's life. Ezekiel also speaks about the righteous life of Noah. The writer to the Hebrews tells us that Noah was a righteous man and a man of faith. Peter claims that Noah was a preacher or a herald of righteousness. The grace of God touched Noah's life. The grace of God marked Noah's life. The grace of God bore fruit in Noah's life. The grace of God was evident for others to see in Noah's life. And you know, friend, if you're a Christian today, if grace is operating in your life, then these same marks will be seen. Last week we said that the fullness of grace is found in Jesus, and from Jesus we receive grace upon grace, grace added to grace, grace overflowing, grace superabundant. And if your life has been touched by this grace, if your life has been touched by Jesus, then the fruit of grace will be there for yourself and others to see. Your life will be marked by righteousness. It'll be lived in conformity to God's holy and right standards. The teachings that Jesus lays out in his Sermon on the Mount, all that Jesus says about righteous conduct, that will be a reality in your life. Furthermore, your life will be marked by blamelessness. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll be perfect. It doesn't mean that you'll be free from sin, but it does mean that you'll be above reproach. You'll stand out as a man or woman of integrity, a man or woman of purity. You'll be seen as someone who is wholehearted when it comes to following God. Finally, your life will be marked by a close walk with God. You may find yourself out of step with your friends, out of step with your family, out of step with your colleagues. You may find yourself out of step with what the world is saying, what the world is doing, but you'll be in step with God. You'll be in step with the Spirit. Your life will be characterized by closeness and communion with the living Christ. He will be the focus and the controlling preoccupation of all that you think and all that you do and all that you say. And even on the days when you sin, the days when you backslide, the days when you fail, and even in the days when your providence is difficult and life is hard, it's so very hard, and darkness may seem to be end, your song, your cry will still be, oh, for a closer walk with God, a calm and heavenly frame, a light to shine upon the road that leads me to the Lamb. Where is the blessedness I knew when I first sought the Lord? Where is the soul-refreshing view of Jesus and his word? That's all you'll long for. So friends, as we consider these verses and this description of Noah, the question that needs to be asked is, does this describe you? Does this describe me? Are we those whose lives are marked by righteousness? When people look at our lives, would they say, well, he's living a Sermon on the Mount life. She's living a Sermon on the Mount life. Are our lives characterized by righteousness? Are our lives characterized by blamelessness in our generation? That when people look at us, when they speak about us, they would say, well, I don't agree with what they believe, but I know this. He is a man of integrity. She is a woman of purity. They are those who are whole and sound when it comes to their commitment to their God. Are we those whose lives are marked by a close walk with God? Those who are in step with God, even if we seem to be out of step with everything and everyone else? Are we those whose lives have been touched and transformed by Jesus? Are we those in whom the fruit of grace is seen to be sprouting and growing and blossoming and flourishing? And if not, friends, why not? If the marks of grace aren't evident in our lives, why aren't they there? Why isn't it evident that we are those who are recipients of the grace of God? So there's the description of Noah. Second, we have the declaration of God, verses 11 to 13. And here Moses focuses on God's righteousness. God's righteousness. Verses 11 and 12, Moses tells us what God saw. We have the analysis of Moses in verse 11. Moses tells us that the earth was corrupt. This word corrupt means to spoil, to ruin, to lay waste, to devastate. It's used by the Old Testament writers to describe ravenous and ravaging lions. It's used by the Old Testament writers to describe destroying angels. And here it's used to describe the condition of the men and women who were living on the earth in Noah's day. Now, in all likelihood, they probably didn't see themselves as corrupt. They probably took pride in the fact that they celebrated diversity and tolerance. But Moses says here they were corrupt. And Moses tells us that the earth wasn't simply filled with corruption, it was also filled with violence. Look again at verse 11. This refers to severe treatment toward another person, causing harm to someone. And the earth, we're told, is filled with violence. Back in Genesis chapter 1, God had commanded the man to fill the earth, to spread his glory throughout the world as his image bearer. And here we're told in Genesis 6 that man has filled the earth, but he has not filled the earth with the Lord's glory as the Lord's image bearer. No, he has filled the earth with violence. But we don't simply have the analysis of Moses, we also have the analysis of God. Look at verse 12. Moses tells us that God saw the earth and its corruption. Verse 5 recorded the fact that God saw the wickedness of the earth and that every intention of the thoughts of man was on evil continually. And now we read again that God saw the corruption on the earth. And God also sees that all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. That is how comprehensive the corruption is. All flesh is now engaged in this. The only exception is Noah, the man who has found favour, the man who has found grace in the eyes of God. You know what's been made very clear in verses 11 and 12 is that God spends time looking at the world. he spends time engaging in this judicial surveillance. He spends time analysing what's going on, or what's been said, what's been done. He doesn't jump to a snap conclusion. He analyses what's going on. And then in verse 13, Moses moves from telling us about what God saw to telling us about what God said. We're told that God spoke to Noah, beginning of verse 13. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern literature, the gods are never really described as communicating with their creatures. But the God of Genesis is so different. Noah's a recipient of this divine favour and is one who walks with God, enjoys closeness with God, enjoys communion with God, and now God speaks to him, takes him into his counsel, brings him into his confidence, and reveals his plans to him. And we're told in verse 13 what God said to Noah. He begins by saying, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Again, we might think of the ancient Near Eastern literature time, and we see that the gods never gave an explanation for their actions. And the reason for that is simple. The gods are as corrupt and as capricious as their creatures. They would wipe out their creatures on a whim, just for making too much noise. Therefore, they can't really justify their actions. But here God says that he is going to make an end of all the earth. Why? Because of their violence. And he continues by saying, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Now, this word destroy is interesting. It's the same word as the word corrupt that Moses has used in verses 11 and 12. Man is ruining and corrupting. And now God says that he is going to ruin, he is going to corrupt. It is a case of poetic justice. It is a case of eye for eye and tooth for tooth. It is a case of divine retribution. God is going to repay man for what man has done, and he is going to repay him with what man has done. And it's important that we note how all-encompassing this judgment is going to be. We see in verse 12 that God is going to make an end of all flesh, and that he is going to destroy the earth. No one's going to escape. The sons of God and daughters of man that we read about in verses 1 and 2, no escape for them. The Nephilim, the famous warriors that we read about in verse 4, no escape for them. The men of art, the men of music, the men of poetry, the men of culture, no escape for them. The craftsmen, the labourers, the farmers, the crofters, no escape for them. The violent men, the murderous men, the adulterous and idolatrous men, no escape for them. The kings, the rulers, the politicians, the people of power and prestige, no escape for them. The people nobody knew about, the people that nobody noticed, no escape for them. The children, the teenagers, the young people with hopes and dreams and aspirations, no escape for them. God has seen and God has spoken, and he says here that his judgment will be all-encompassing. What very solemn words for Noah to hear. At this point, Noah doesn't know about the way of escape, the way of deliverance, the way of salvation that's going to be provided for him. That's only revealed in verse 14 and following. At this point, Noah's left thinking that he, like all flesh, like the rest of the earth, will be wiped out, made an end of, destroyed. He thinks that there is no way out for him. Well, friends, as we hear this declaration of God, we are being reminded that he is the just judge. He is a just judge. This passage presents him as the just judge. He's the judge. He's the one who's created all things. He's the one who evaluates all things. And he's the one who has the final say, the final decision on all things. And he is the just judge. He's the one who meets the corruption of the world with destruction. And this is entirely right, entirely fair, entirely just. If God doesn't do so, then it would mean that he is out of touch with his creation and not much of a moral God. If God doesn't do something, then it would suggest that he's not holy and that he doesn't care about righteousness and goodness. If God doesn't do something, then it would indicate that he is far from being the judge of all the earth who does what is right. So this passage presents God as the just judge. And as we go through Scripture, we see that Jesus is the just judge. He's the judge. He's the gracious advocate and the friend of sinners. That is a comfort, that is a truth, that is a wonderful joy for us to reflect on day by day, that Jesus is the friend of sinners. He is the gracious advocate. He is the one who makes intercession for his people, but he is also the one who has been appointed to judge the living and the dead. He's the one who has been appointed to judge the earth on the day that the events that Genesis 6 to 9 merely predict and foreshadow. And he is not simply the judge. He is the just judge. The Psalms frequently tell us that he's the one who is going to judge the world with righteousness. He is the one who is going to do what is right. He will redress every wrong. He will repay the wicked, and he will reward his people. And on his day of judgment, no one is going to be able to turn to him saying, "What have you done?" On his day of judgment, no one is going to be able to say, "Wait 1 minute, this is a miscarriage of justice, this isn't right, this isn't fair." No, Jesus is the just judge. And so there is a word for everyone who's listening today. The truth of this just judge is an encouragement for every Christian. The prophet Habakkuk looked at the world in his day and he cried out to God, "Why do you tolerate wrong?" And perhaps that's your prayer. Perhaps you look at the world. Perhaps you look at the things that are happening on the streets or the chambers of power and you cry out, "Oh God, why do you tolerate wrong? Why do you allow this to happen?" But Jesus is coming and he is going to execute justice. He is going to do what is right. In his Narnia books, C.S. Lewis speaks about the coming of Aslan, that great lion, and he is going to end the witch's wintry enchantment. He is going to bring it to an end. And the children are told wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we will have spring again. And that is the encouragement, friends, for every Christian. Aslan is coming. Jesus is coming. The judge is on his way. And he is going to redress every wrong. And he is going to repay the wicked. And he is going to reward his people. That is the encouragement for every Christian. The world isn't going to just go on in this circle and cycle of wickedness and violence. The just judge is coming and he is going to resolve it all. He is going to execute justice. But you know, the truth of the just judge is also an encouragement to those who may not be Christians. In the Narnia books, Edmund, who's a follower of the White Witch, hears about the coming of Aslan. And he's filled with what C.S. Lewis describes as mysterious horror. The coming of Aslan's not good news for him. And you know, friend, the coming of Jesus, the coming of the judge will be a horror for all those who haven't received the grace that is found in him. Those who aren't walking with him. And so this truth should be an encouragement to come and receive this grace. Come and receive Jesus as he is offered in the gospel. That's what the truth of Jesus as the just judge should do if you're not a Christian. It should be what compels you and propels you toward Jesus. It's an encouragement. Well, friends, as we consider these verses, and as we hear this declaration from God, the question that needs to be asked is this good news or bad news for you today? Does the thought of the Lord's coming and his judgment hold out the promise of the end of winter and the beginning of spring, the prospect of indescribable joy? Or does it hold out the prospect of mysterious and unimaginable horror? Is the prospect of the coming of the just judge good or bad news for you? Today the Lord's given each of us this incredible opportunity, an opportunity to turn to him, an opportunity to call on his name, an opportunity to receive the grace and promises of salvation that are found in him. Friends, let's not plan to do so. So many people plan to do business with Jesus, but in reality they are putting it off. They are procrastinating. Friends, let's not plan to do so. Let's actually do so while there is still time, before the window of opportunity closes and the just judge and his righteous judgment are revealed from heaven. Friends, while there is time, let's call on the name of the Lord. Let's turn to him and let's receive the grace and promises of salvation that are found in him. What we find in this passage is the Lord gives Noah this warning. And in giving Noah this warning, this reminder about a coming judgment, Noah is going to be all the more receptive when the Lord makes the way of salvation known to him. And today this portion of God's word has reminded us, it has warned us about a coming judgment. A judgment far greater than the flood. And therefore, in giving us this warning, it should make each and every one of us all more receptive to running to Jesus and clinging to him by faith. Amen. Let's close by singing to God's praise the words of the hymn, His mercy is more.